The knock on the door was firm. 3 sharp raps that cut through the cheerful chatter of my 30th birthday party. My fiancé, Liam, shot me a questioning look from across the room, his brow furrowed. I shrugged, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. We weren't expecting anyone else. Liam opened the door to a uniformed police officer, his face grim. The music seemed to die down, the laughter fading into an expectant silence. "I'm looking for Rebecca," the officer said, his voice carrying a weight that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Every head turned towards me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of confusion and fear. Why was a cop asking for me by name on my birthday? Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. To understand the absurdity of that moment, you have to understand my family. For my entire life, I have been the designated adult. I was the one who remembered birthdays, organised holiday gatherings, and mediated the constant simmering arguments between my parents. I was the one who co-signed for my younger brother's first car, a decision I came to regret almost immediately. My brother Kevin is the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, even when he was actively doing wrong. He'd coasted through life on a wave of my parents' adoration and my quiet, resentful support. They'd bailed him out of every bad decision, every financial scrape, always with the same tired excuse. "He's just finding his way, Rebecca. You're the strong one." Being the strong one was a role I never auditioned for, but was typecast in from birth. It meant my achievements were expected, my struggles were overlooked, and my boundaries were treated as suggestions. For years, I'd swallowed my frustration, telling myself it was just the price of keeping the peace. It was a peace I was beginning to realise was costing me everything. Liam was the first person to see the cracks in the facade. We'd been dating for a year when he first witnessed one of my family's infamous Sunday dinners. Kevin had just announced he was quitting his job to find his passion, a passion that apparently required him to move back into our parents' house and live rent-free. My parents had cooed with support, offering him money and encouragement. When I'd cautiously mentioned my own recent promotion at work, my mother had patted my hand and said, "That's nice, dear," before immediately turning back to Kevin to ask what he wanted for dinner. Later that night, Liam had held my hand and said, "That was something." It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the blatant disparity, the casual way my accomplishments were dismissed while Kevin's failures were celebrated. It was a small thing, a throwaway comment, but it was the first brick in the wall I would eventually build between my family and me. The wall that would lead to a police officer on my doorstep, asking for me by name. The months leading up to my 30th birthday had been a masterclass in my family's particular brand of dysfunction. It started with the planning of the party itself. I'd wanted something small, a quiet dinner with a few close friends. My mother, however, had other ideas. 30 is a milestone, Rebecca, she'd insisted. We have to do something special. Her idea of special was a lavish party at a rented hall, with a guest list that included everyone she'd ever met. I tried to protest, to explain that it wasn't what I wanted, but my objections were waved away. "Don't be difficult, dear. This is for you." It was a classic move, framing her own desires as a selfless act of love for me. I'd eventually given in, as I always did, worn down by the sheer force of her will. The party planning became a source of constant stress, a daily barrage of phone calls and emails from my mother, each one with a new demand, a new crisis that only I could solve. The caterer needed a deposit, the DJ needed a playlist, the florist needed a colour scheme. I was working a full-time job, trying to plan a wedding, and now I was also the unpaid event planner for a party I didn't even want. Through it all, Liam was my rock, my sounding board, my co-conspirator in late-night rants, fueled by cheap wine and righteous indignation. He was the one who pointed out that my mother had yet to ask for my opinion on a single aspect of the party. He was the one who noticed that every decision she made seemed to be more about impressing her friends than celebrating me. He was the one who held me when I finally broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. "You know you don't have to do this, right?" he'd said, his voice gentle but firm. "You can say no." The thought was so foreign, so utterly alien to me, that I almost laughed. Say no to my mother. It was like trying to say no to a hurricane. But the seed was planted, a tiny, rebellious sprout in the barren landscape of my own compliance. I started to push back, in small ways at first. I vetoed the ice sculpture my mother wanted, a monstrosity in the shape of a swan. I insisted on a playlist that included music I actually liked, not just the 70s soft rock my parents favoured. Each small victory was a revelation, a taste of a freedom I'd never known. My mother's reaction was predictable. She pouted, she sighed, she lamented to anyone who would listen about how ungrateful I was being. But I held firm, bolstered by Liam's unwavering support. The party, when it finally arrived, was a strange hybrid of my mother's grand ambitions and my own quiet rebellion. The rented hall was still there. The guest list was still bloated with my mother's acquaintances. But the music was good. The food was what I'd chosen, and the swan-shaped ice sculpture was nowhere to be seen. I was actually starting to enjoy myself, surrounded by my friends, with Liam's hand warm in mine. And then, the knock on the door. The officer's eyes scanned the room, landing on me with an unnerving intensity. "I need to ask you a few questions," he said, his voice low and serious. "In private." The room was silent, the air thick with a tension I could taste. Liam squeezed my hand, a silent promise of support. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, and followed the officer out of the room, my own birthday party fading behind me like a half-remembered dream. The questions were about my car. Had I lent it to anyone recently? Was I aware of its current location? I answered in a daze, my mind racing to make sense of it all. My car was parked in my garage, where it always was. I hadn't lent it to anyone. The officer listened patiently, his expression unreadable. Then he dropped the bombshell. My car had been involved in a hit-and-run accident an hour ago. The driver had fled the scene, but a witness had gotten the license plate number. My license plate number. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the floor dropping out from under me. It was impossible. My car was at home. I had the only key. Unless... A cold, sickening realization began to dawn on me, a truth so ugly I could barely bring myself to face it. There was another key, a spare key. A spare key I had given to my parents years ago, for emergencies. An emergency that had apparently just arrived, in the form of a police officer on my doorstep. The officer's words hung in the air, a cloud of disbelief and dawning horror. My car. A hit and run. It was a sentence that didn't belong in the story of my life. A plot twist from a movie I'd never wanted to see. My mind, a frantic Rolodex of possibilities, kept landing on the same unthinkable conclusion. Kevin. It had to be Kevin. Who else would have access to my car? Who else would be so reckless, so thoughtless, so utterly devoid of a conscience? The officer was still talking, his voice a low murmur in the background of my own internal chaos. He was asking about my brother, about his driving record, about his habits. I answered his questions on autopilot, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Yes, my brother lived with my parents. No, he didn't have his own car. Yes, he had a history of... what was the polite term for it? Irresponsible behaviour? The officer nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He'd seen this story before in 1,000 different forms. The prodigal son, the long-suffering daughter, the parents who enabled it all. He gave me his card, told me to call him if I remembered anything else, and left me standing in the hallway, the echo of his footsteps a death knell for the life I had known. I walked back into the party, a ghost at my own celebration. The music was playing again, the chatter had resumed, but the mood had shifted. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the kind of morbid curiosity that a car crash in the middle of a birthday party inevitably inspires. Liam met me at the door, his face a mask of concern. "What's going on?" he whispered, his eyes searching mine for an answer I didn't have. I shook my head, unable to form the words. The truth was a poison I couldn't bring myself to speak. Not yet. I needed to know for sure. I needed to see the look on my brother's face when I confronted him. I found my parents in a corner, holding court with a group of their friends, their faces flushed with wine and self-satisfaction. They smiled when they saw me, my mother opening her arms for a hug. "There's the birthday girl," she trilled, her voice grating on my already frayed nerves. I pulled away, my body stiff with a cold, hard anger. "Where's Kevin?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. My mother's smile faltered, a flicker of unease in her eyes. "He had to leave early, dear. He wasn't feeling well." It was a lie, a clumsy, transparent lie, and we both knew it. Kevin was never sick. He was invincible, a force of nature, a hurricane of his own making. He was also a terrible liar, a trait he had apparently inherited from our mother. "I need to talk to him," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Now." My father, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. "Rebecca, don't make a scene. It's your birthday." The irony of his words was a bitter pill in my throat. My birthday. The day I was supposed to be celebrated, to be cherished, to be the centre of attention. Instead, I was a supporting character in the latest episode of The Kevin Show, the one where he steals my car, gets into a hit and run, and leaves me to clean up the mess. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years finally boiled over, a volcanic eruption of a rage so pure, so potent, it was almost exhilarating. "A scene?" I said, my voice rising with every word. "You think I'm making a scene? My car has been in a hit-and-run accident and you're worried about me making a scene?" The colour drained from my mother's face, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. My father's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. They knew. Of course they knew. They had probably been the ones to give him the key. The thought was a fresh wave of betrayal, a tsunami of a pain so deep it threatened to drown me. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving them in a stunned, guilty silence. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out of there, away from the prying eyes, the whispered questions, the suffocating weight of my family's lies. Liam followed me, his hand a warm, steady presence on my back. He didn't say anything, just guided me out of the hall, into the cool night air. The silence was a balm, a blessed relief from the cacophony of my own thoughts. We stood there for a long time, the sounds of the city a distant hum in the background. I stared up at the sky, a vast, indifferent expanse of a darkness, and felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The worst had happened. The thing I had been dreading for years, the thing I had twisted myself into knots to avoid, had finally come to pass. And I was still standing. The thought was a revelation, a flicker of a light in the darkness. I was still standing. And I was done being the strong one. I was. Done being the responsible one. I was done being the one who cleaned up everyone else's messes. I was done. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving with a newfound sense of purpose. I found the officer's number and pressed call. "I remember something," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I think I know who was driving my car." The aftermath of that phone call was a blur of flashing lights, stern-faced police officers, and the kind of hushed, dramatic whispers that follow a family implosion. My parents, when confronted with the undeniable truth, crumbled like a pair of stale cookies. My mother's carefully constructed facade of maternal devotion shattered, revealing the desperate, enabling woman underneath. She wept. She pleaded. She tried to bargain with the police, with me, with God himself. "He's a good boy," she'd sobbed, a mantra she'd been repeating for 25 years, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "He just made a mistake." A mistake. The words were a slap in the face, a casual dismissal of the fact that her good boy had left a person injured on the side of the road, a person who could have been seriously hurt, or worse. The fact that he'd stolen my car, my property, my sense of security, was a mere footnote in the grand tragedy of Kevin's latest mistake. My father, on the other hand, was a study in stoic, simmering rage. His anger, however, was not directed at his son, the actual perpetrator of the crime. It was directed at me. I had broken the unspoken rule of our family, the one that had governed our lives for as long as I could remember. Protect Kevin at all costs. I had chosen the truth over the lie, justice over loyalty, myself over him. And for that, I was unforgivable. He'd stood in the driveway, his face a thundercloud of a fury, and told me I was no longer his daughter. The words, which would have once shattered me, now felt strangely hollow, like a threat from a man who had long since lost his power over me. I had spent my entire life trying to earn his approval, to be the daughter he wanted me to be. And now, in the wreckage of my 30th birthday, I realized I didn't want it anymore. I didn't want to be the daughter of a man who would choose his delinquent son over his responsible daughter, a man who would sacrifice my well-being for the sake of a lie. I had spent my life in a cage of my own making, a cage built of guilt, of obligation, of a desperate need to be loved. And now, the door was finally open. Kevin, when they finally found him, was hiding at a friend's house, drunk and belligerent. He denied everything, of course, with the kind of blustering, indignant rage that was his trademark. He accused me of setting him up, of trying to ruin his life, of being a jealous, vindictive shrew. The words were a familiar refrain, a song I'd heard 1,000 times before. But this time the lyrics had changed. This time there was a chorus of police officers, a mountain of evidence, and a witness who had picked his face out of a lineup. The truth, it turned out, was a stubborn thing, a weed that would grow in the most inhospitable of places. The legal proceedings were a long, drawn-out affair, a slow, agonizing crawl through the labyrinthine corridors of the justice system. My parents hired the best lawyer money could buy, a shark in a three-piece suit who tried to paint Kevin as a victim, a troubled young man who had been led astray by a cruel, uncaring world. He tried to paint me as the villain, the cold, heartless sister who had thrown her own brother to the wolves. It was a masterful performance, a symphony of manipulation and deceit, and it almost worked. But in the end, the truth prevailed. Kevin was found guilty of hit and run, of driving under the influence, of grand theft auto. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a sentence that was, in my opinion, far too lenient for the damage he had caused. My parents were devastated, of course. They saw the verdict as a personal attack, a betrayal of the highest order. They refused to speak to me, to even look at me. I was a pariah, a ghost in the family I had once called my own. And you know what? It was the most liberating experience of my life. For the first time, I was free. Free from the guilt, the obligation, the constant crushing weight of their expectations. I was free to be myself, to live my own life, to make my own choices. Liam and I moved to a new city, a place where no one knew my name, where I was not defined by my family's dysfunction. We built a new life, a life filled with love, with laughter, with the kind of quiet, unassuming joy I had never known. I got a new job, a new car, a new phone number. I cut off all contact with my parents, with my brother, with the toxic, suffocating world I had left behind. It was a clean break, a surgical excision of the cancer that had been poisoning my life for so long. And I have never, not for one single moment, regretted it. The silence that followed the verdict was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over our lives. My parents, who had once been a constant clamouring presence, were suddenly gone, their voices reduced to the angry accusatory messages they left on my voicemail, messages I deleted without listening to. The family I had known, the one that had been the centre of my universe for 3 decades, had ceased to exist. And in its place, there was a void, a vast, empty space, that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The first few months were the hardest. I was adrift, a ship without a rudder, a planet without a sun. My identity had been so wrapped up in my role as the responsible daughter, the long-suffering sister, that I didn't know who I was without it. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding with a nameless anxiety, a sense of a dread that I couldn't shake. I would find myself reaching for the phone to call my mother, to tell her about my day, to ask for her advice, before remembering that she was no longer a part of my life. The habits of a lifetime are hard to break, and the habit of seeking my mother's approval was a particularly stubborn one. Liam was my anchor in the storm, my constant unwavering source of a support. He listened to my fears. He held me when I cried. He reminded me, again and again, that I had done the right thing. "You chose yourself," he would say, his voice a soothing balm on my raw, frayed nerves. "You chose your own happiness, your own well-being, and that is never a mistake." He was right, of course. I knew he was right. But knowing it in my head and feeling it in my heart were two very different things. The guilt was a relentless, insidious thing, a weed that would sprout in the most unexpected of places. I would see a mother and daughter laughing together in a coffee shop, and a pang of a longing would hit me so hard it would take my breath away. I would hear a song on the radio that my father used to love, and the tears would come, hot and fast and unexpected. The grief was a physical thing, a weight in my chest, a lump in my throat. I was mourning the loss of a family I had never really had, the idealized, picture-perfect family of my dreams. The reality, I was slowly coming to realize, was far more complicated, far more painful than I had ever allowed myself to admit. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after the trial. I was at home, nursing a cold, feeling sorry for myself, when the doorbell rang. It was a delivery, a large, ornate flower arrangement with a card attached. The flowers were from my mother. The card was a single, handwritten sentence. "I miss my daughter." The words were a punch to the gut, a carefully calculated missile designed to hit me where I was most vulnerable. For a moment, I was tempted to call her, to open the door just a crack, to let her back into my life. The old familiar patterns of a guilt and obligation were a siren song, luring me back to the rocky shores of my past. But then I looked at the flowers, a gaudy, ostentatious display of a remorse, and I saw them for what they were: a bribe, a manipulation, a desperate attempt to regain control. She didn't miss her daughter, she missed her scapegoat, her emotional punching bag, her unpaid therapist. She missed the person who would always put her own needs last, the person who would always forgive, always forget, always come back for more. I took the flowers and I threw them in the trash. It was a small act of a defiance, a quiet rebellion, but it was a turning point. It was the moment I finally, truly, chose myself. It was the moment I realized that I was not responsible for my mother's happiness, for my father's anger, for my brother's choices. I was only responsible for my own. And my own happiness, I was beginning to understand, was a precious, fragile thing, a thing that needed to be protected, to be nurtured, to be fought for. The road to healing was a long and winding one, with its share of potholes and detours. But for the first time in my life, I was the one behind the wheel. I was the one choosing the destination. And I was never, ever going back. The decision to move was a mutual one. A silent agreement between Liam and me that a change of a scenery was not just wanted, but necessary. We needed a clean slate, a place where the ghosts of my past couldn't find us, a place where we could build a future that was entirely our own. We chose a small coastal town, 3 states away, a place where the air was clean, the people were friendly, and the ocean was a constant soothing presence. The move was a whirlwind of packing boxes, of tearful goodbyes to friends, of the exhilarating, terrifying prospect of a new beginning. We sold our house, we quit our jobs, we packed our lives into a moving truck and drove away without a backward glance. The first few weeks in our new town were a strange, disorienting dream. We were strangers in a strange land, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar streets, unfamiliar sounds. But there was a sense of a freedom in the anonymity, a sense of a possibility in the unknown. We were no longer defined by our pasts, by the roles we had played, by the expectations of others. We were just Rebecca and Liam, 2 people in love, starting over. We bought a small, charming house with a big, overgrown garden, a house that needed a lot of a work, a lot of a love, a lot of a us. We spent our days painting walls, sanding floors, planting flowers. We were building a home, not just a house, a sanctuary, a place where we could be safe, where we could be ourselves, where we could finally, truly, be happy. I found a job at a local library, a quiet, peaceful place, filled with the scent of old books and the gentle hum of whispered conversations. It was a world away from the high-stress, high-pressure corporate job I had left behind, and I loved it. I spent my days surrounded by stories, by words, by the infinite, endless possibilities of the human imagination. And in the quiet, dusty corners of the library, I began to find my own story, my own voice, my own sense of a self. Liam, who had always dreamed of starting his own business, opened a small, independent bookstore in the heart of a downtown. It was a risky venture, a leap of faith, but it was a dream we were determined to make a reality. We poured our hearts, our souls, our life savings into that bookstore, and to our amazement, it flourished. The town embraced us, embraced our little store, embraced the passion and the love we had poured into it. We became a part of the community, a part of the fabric of the town. We made friends, we joined a book club, we adopted a stray dog we named Hemingway. We were building a life, a real life, a life that was so much richer, so much fuller, so much more authentic than the one I had left behind. The years passed, a gentle flowing river of a time. We got married on a windswept beach at sunset, surrounded by a small group of close friends, the sound of the waves a symphony of a hope and a promise. We travelled, we explored, we created a lifetime of memories, a tapestry of shared experiences that bound us together, that made us stronger, that made us whole. The ghosts of my past still visited me sometimes, in the dead of a night, in the quiet moments of a doubt and a fear. But they were no longer the terrifying, all-consuming monsters they had once been. They were just shadows, faint echoes of a life I had long since left behind. I learned to live with them, to acknowledge them, to even, in a strange way, be grateful for them. For they were a reminder of how far I had come, of the strength I had found, of the happiness I had fought for and won. And for that, I would be forever grateful. The bookstore became our sanctuary, a haven of quiet corners and the smell of aging paper. It was more than a business. It was the heart of our new life, the place where we connected with our community, where we built friendships one book at a time. Liam had a knack for it, a genuine, infectious enthusiasm for stories that drew people in. He could recommend the perfect book for a broken heart, for a long journey, for a lazy Sunday afternoon. He created a space that was warm and welcoming, a place where people felt seen, where they felt understood. I would watch him from the counter, a quiet observer of the little world we had created, and my heart would swell with a love so fierce, so profound it was almost painful. He had seen the best and the worst of me. He had held my hand through the fire, and he had never, not for one moment, wavered in his belief in me. He was my rock, my anchor, my true north. He was the family I had chosen, the family I had earned. We fell into a comfortable rhythm, a life that was both predictable and surprising. We would wake up early, walk Hemingway on the beach, and open the bookstore at 10. We would spend our days surrounded by books, by people, by the quiet, unassuming magic of a small-town life. In the evenings we would cook dinner together, we would read, we would talk for hours about everything and nothing. It was a simple life, a quiet life, but it was a life that was filled with a love, with a purpose, with a deep, abiding sense of a peace. The wounds of my past were still there, of course, a faint, silvery tracery of scars on my heart. But they no longer ached with the same intensity, the same raw, all-consuming pain. They were a part of me, a part of my story, but they were no longer the whole story. I had learned to carry them with a grace, with a compassion, with a quiet, unyielding strength. I had learned that forgiveness is not about condoning the actions of others, but about releasing yourself from the prison of your own anger. I had learned that healing is not a destination, but a journey, a process of a becoming, of a unfolding, of a slowly, painstakingly putting the pieces of yourself back together again. And I had learned that love, true love, is not about possession, but about liberation. It is about finding the person who sees you, who accepts you, who celebrates you, for exactly who you are. It is about finding the person who makes you want to be the best version of yourself, the person who inspires you to be braver, to be kinder, to be more compassionate. It is about finding the person who makes you feel like you are finally, truly, home. One rainy afternoon, a woman came into the bookstore, a woman with a kind face and a sad, gentle smile. She browsed for a while, her fingers trailing over the spines of the books, before finally approaching the counter. "I'm looking for a book," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. A book about forgiveness. Liam, who was shelving books nearby, came over, his face a mask of a gentle concern. "Is there a particular kind of a forgiveness you're looking for?" he asked, his voice kind, non-judgmental. The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes filling with tears. "The kind you give to yourself," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. My heart ached for her, for the pain that was so clearly etched on her face. I knew that pain. I had lived that pain. I had breathed that pain. I came out from behind the counter and took her hand. "I think I have just the book for you," I said, my voice gentle, reassuring. I led her to a quiet corner of the store, to a shelf filled with books about healing, about hope, about the resilience of the human spirit. I pulled out a slim volume of a poetry, a book that had been my constant companion in the darkest days of my own journey. "This one?" I said, pressing the book into her hands. "This one helped me." The woman looked at me, her eyes filled with a gratitude, with a dawning fragile hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." She bought the book and left, a small, tentative smile on her face. I watched her go, a sense of a peace settling over me, a sense of a purpose, of a meaning. I had taken my pain and I had transformed it into something beautiful, something useful, something that could help others. I had taken the broken pieces of my life and I had created a mosaic, a work of art, a testament to the power of a hope, of a healing, of a love. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as vast as the ocean, that I was finally, truly whole. Life continued its gentle, unhurried pace. The bookstore thrived, becoming a beloved local institution. Hemingway grew old and grey, his walks on the beach becoming shorter, his naps in the sun becoming longer. We celebrated birthdays. We mourned losses. We navigated the ordinary, extraordinary journey of a life together. The silence from my family was absolute, a wall of unspoken words and unresolved anger that stood between us, as solid and as impenetrable as the Great Wall of China. I had made my peace with it, had accepted it as a necessary casualty of my own liberation. But there were still moments, rare and fleeting, when a wave of a sadness would wash over me, a longing for a connection that was lost, for a love that was never meant to be. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, a letter with a familiar, spidery handwriting that made my heart skip a beat. It was from my mother. I stared at the envelope for a long time, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to pretend it had never arrived. But another part of me, a small, curious, stubbornly hopeful part of me, wanted to know what it said. I finally opened it, my fingers trembling slightly. The letter was short, just a few lines, but the words were a bombshell that shattered the quiet, peaceful world I had so carefully constructed. My father was sick, very sick. The cancer had come back with a vengeance, and the doctors had given him only a few months to live. The news was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. My father, the man who had been a towering, formidable presence in my life for so long, the man who had disowned me, who had called me a traitor, a disgrace, a disappointment. The man I had hated, the man I had feared, the man I had, in a small, secret corner of my heart, never stopped loving. The letter was a plea, a desperate last-ditch effort to mend the broken pieces of our family before it was too late. My mother wrote of my father's regret, of his desire to see me one last time, to ask for my forgiveness. The words were a carefully crafted symphony of a guilt and a manipulation, a masterpiece of the emotional blackmail. And I, to my eternal shame, almost fell for it. The old familiar patterns of a behaviour, the ones I thought I had long since shed, came rushing back, a tidal wave of a guilt and an obligation that threatened to pull me under. He was my father. He was dying. How could I not go? How could I be so cruel, so heartless, so unforgiving? Liam, as always, was my voice of a reason, my anchor in the storm. He listened patiently as I paced the floor, as I raged, as I wept, as I wrestled with the demons of my past. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't offer easy answers. He just held my hand and reminded me of the truth. "This is not your fault," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You are not responsible for his happiness, for his peace, for his redemption. You are only responsible for your own." The words were a lifeline, a beacon of a light in the darkness of my own confusion. He was right. I had spent my entire life trying to be the daughter my father wanted me to be, and it had almost destroyed me. I would not go back to that. I would not sacrifice my own hard-won peace for the sake of a man who had never truly loved me, who had never truly seen me, who had never truly valued me. I wrote a letter back to my mother, a letter that was short and to the point. I told her I was sorry for my father's illness, that I wished him peace in his final days. But I would not be coming to see him. I would not be a part of the final act of the tragic, dysfunctional play that was our family. The letter was the hardest thing I had ever written, a final definitive severing of the ties that had bound me for so long. But it was also the most liberating. I had chosen myself. I had chosen my own happiness. I had chosen my own peace. And I had never been more certain of anything in my life. My father died 2 months later. My mother called to tell me, her voice a strange, hollow echo on the other end of the line. She was surprisingly calm, almost matter-of-fact, as if she were reporting the weather, not the death of her husband of 40 years. There were no tears, no hysterics, no accusations. Just a quiet, resigned sadness that was more unsettling than any outburst of a grief would have been. She told me the time and place of the funeral, a small private service for family and close friends. She did not ask me to come. She did not need to. The invitation was implied, a silent, unspoken expectation that I would do my duty, that I would play my part, that I would be the good, forgiving daughter in the end. I hung up the phone, a wave of a nausea washing over me. The thought of attending the funeral, of being in the same room as my family, of facing the judgment, the condemnation, the suffocating weight of their grief, was more than I could bear. But the thought of not going, of turning my back on my father's final farewell, felt like a betrayal, a final, unforgivable act of cruelty. I was trapped, caught in the crossfire of my own conflicting emotions, a war between my head and my heart, between the past and the present, between the person I had been and the person I was trying to become. Liam, who had been listening from the other room, came and sat beside me, his presence a silent, comforting weight. He didn't say anything, just took my hand in his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles on my skin. He knew, without me having to say a word, the turmoil that was raging inside of me. He knew the power that my family still held over me, the deep, ingrained patterns of a guilt and an obligation that was so hard to break. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, a steady, rhythmic reminder that time was passing, that life was moving forward, whether I was ready for it or not. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked, his voice soft, gentle, devoid of a judgment. The question was so simple, so direct, yet it was a question I had never learned to ask myself. What did I want? Not what was expected of me, not what was right, not what was proper. But what did I, Rebecca, in the deepest, most honest corner of my heart, truly want? The answer, when it came, was a surprise, even to myself. I didn't want to go to the funeral. I didn't want to see my family. I didn't want to pretend to be something I was not, to feel something I did not. I wanted to mourn my father in my own way, in my own time, on my own terms. I wanted to remember the good times, the rare, fleeting moments of a connection we had shared, without the shadow of the bad times, the anger, the disappointment, the pain. I wanted to say goodbye to the man he had been, the man he could have been, the man I had loved, in spite of everything. I told Liam my decision, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his eyes filled with a love, with a pride, with a deep, unwavering understanding. "Then that's what we'll do," he said, his voice firm, resolute. The day of the funeral, we drove to the beach, the same beach where we had gotten married, the same beach where we had walked Hemingway 1,000 times. We stood at the water's edge, the wind whipping our hair, the waves crashing against the shore, a wild, untamed symphony of a nature. I wrote a letter to my father, a letter filled with all the things I had never said, all the things I had been too afraid to say, all the things I wished I had said. I told him I loved him. I told him I forgave him. I told him I was sorry. I folded the letter into a small paper boat, and I set it adrift on the waves, a tiny, fragile vessel, carrying the weight of my grief, of my love, of my hope. I watched it until it was a tiny, white speck on the horizon, until it was swallowed by the vast blue expanse of the ocean. And as it disappeared from view, I felt a sense of a peace settle over me, a sense of a closure, of a release. I had said my goodbye. I had made my peace. And I was finally, truly free. In the years that followed my father's death, a strange, unexpected thing happened. The anger I had carried for so long, the righteous, burning indignation that had fueled my rebellion, began to fade. It was not a conscious decision, not a deliberate act of forgiveness, but a slow, gradual erosion, like a rock being worn smooth by the relentless, gentle pressure of the tide. In its place, a new emotion began to emerge, an emotion that was far more complex, far more nuanced, far more human. It was compassion. I began to see my parents not as the monstrous one-dimensional villains of my own personal melodrama, but as flawed, broken people, doing the best they could with the tools they had been given. I began to see their actions not as a deliberate, malicious attempt to hurt me, but as a misguided, desperate attempt to love me, to protect me, to control me. It was a love that was twisted and toxic and suffocating, but it was a love nonetheless. I began to see my father not as the tyrannical, emotionally distant patriarch of my childhood, but as a man who had been raised in a different time, a different world, a world where men were taught to be strong, to be silent, to suppress their emotions, to hide their vulnerabilities. He had loved me in the only way he knew how, a clumsy, awkward, inarticulate love that was often expressed through criticism, through judgment, through a desperate, misguided attempt to make me into the person he thought I should be. I began to see my mother not as the manipulative, narcissistic queen of a gaslighting, but as a woman who had been trapped in a loveless marriage, a woman who had poured all of her own unfulfilled dreams, all of her own frustrated ambitions, all of her own desperate, unrequited love into her children. She had clung to Kevin, her golden child, her prodigal son, because he was the one who needed her, the one who made her feel valued, the one who gave her a sense of a purpose. She had pushed me away, her responsible, independent daughter, because I was the one who didn't need her, the one who reminded her of her own limitations, of her own failures, of her own unlived life. This newfound compassion did not excuse their behaviour. It did not erase the pain they had caused. It did not make me want to welcome them back into my life with open arms. But it did allow me to see them with a new clarity, a new understanding, a new sense of a peace. It allowed me to let go of the anger, the resentment, the bitterness that had been poisoning my own heart for so long. It allowed me to finally, truly move on. One day, a package arrived in the mail. A small, unassuming cardboard box with no return address. Inside there was a photo album, a collection of old, faded photographs from my childhood. There were pictures of me as a baby, a chubby, smiling infant with my father's eyes and my mother's hair. There were pictures of me as a little girl, a gap-toothed, pigtailed tomboy, riding my bike, climbing trees, playing with my brother. There were pictures of family vacations, of birthday parties, of holiday gatherings, a carefully curated collection of happy memories, a testament to a life that had once been, a life that could have been. At the back of the album, there was a single handwritten note on a piece of plain white paper. It was from my mother. "I thought you might want these," it said. "I love you." The words were so simple, so direct, so utterly devoid of a manipulation or a guile that they brought tears to my eyes. It was the first time in my life that she had said those words to me without an agenda, without a hidden motive, without an expectation of something in return. It was a peace offering, a white flag, a tentative, fragile bridge across the vast, silent chasm that had separated us for so long. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I was ready, if I was willing, if I was able to let her back into my life, even in this small, tentative way. I put the album on a shelf in the back of my closet, a tangible reminder of a past I was still trying to reconcile with my present. And there it sat, for a long, long time, a succulent, unopened chapter of my life, waiting to be read. The photo album became a silent, ever-present character in our home. I'd catch glimpses of its plain cardboard spine tucked away on the top shelf of the closet, a rectangular shadow holding a lifetime of memories I was too afraid to touch. It was a Pandora's box of a nostalgia and a pain, and I was terrified of what would happen if I lifted the lid. Liam, in his infinite wisdom, never pushed. He knew this was a journey I had to take on my own, a mountain I had to climb at my own pace. He'd simply give my shoulder a reassuring squeeze whenever he saw me staring at the closet door, a silent acknowledgement of the battle being waged within me. Life, in its relentless forward march, continued to unfold. The bookstore celebrated its 10th anniversary, a milestone that filled us with a quiet, humble pride. We'd built something real, something lasting, something that had become a part of the very soul of our town. Hemingway, our faithful furry companion, finally succumbed to the ravages of our old age, leaving a dog-shaped hole in our hearts that we filled with the love of a new, rambunctious rescue puppy we named Fitzgerald. The world kept spinning, the seasons kept changing, and the photo album remained on the shelf, a silent, patient sentinel. The catalyst for change came, as it so often does, in the most unexpected of ways. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a slow, rainy day at the bookstore. A young woman came in, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She wandered aimlessly through the aisles, her shoulders slumped, her entire being radiating a grief so profound it was almost a physical thing. I approached her cautiously, my heart aching with a familiar, empathetic pang. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, my voice soft. She looked up, her eyes filled with a raw, unfiltered pain. "My mother just died," she blurted out, the words a torrent of a pent-up sorrow. "And I don't know how to feel." The words hung in the air between us, a shared confession, a secret handshake of a grief. I led her to a comfortable armchair in a quiet corner of the store. I made her a cup of tea, and I listened. She talked for hours, her story pouring out of her in a jumbled emotional torrent. She spoke of a difficult, complicated relationship, of a love that was both a comfort and a cage, of a guilt and a regret that were so intertwined she couldn't tell them apart. She spoke of a mother she had loved, and a mother she had resented, a mother she had admired, and a mother she had feared. And as I listened to her story, I heard the echoes of my own. I saw my own struggles, my own pain, my own confusion reflected in her tear-filled eyes. I saw the same tangled knot of a love and a resentment, of a loyalty and a betrayal, of a grief and a relief. And in that moment of a shared vulnerability, something inside of me shifted. I realized that I was not alone in my experience, that my story was not unique, that the messy, complicated, often painful dance of a mother's and a daughter's was a universal one. After the young woman had left, her shoulders a little lighter, her eyes a little clearer, I went home and I took the photo album down from the shelf. I sat on the floor, the album in my lap, and I took a deep, steadying breath. And then I opened it. The pictures were a flood of memories, a tidal wave of emotions that washed over me, threatening to pull me under. There was my father, young and handsome, his arm around my mother, a genuine, unforced smile on his face. There was my mother, radiant and beautiful, her eyes sparkling with a life and a laughter. There was Kevin, a mischievous, gap-toothed grin on his face, his arm slung around my shoulders in a rare, unguarded moment of a brotherly affection. And there was me, a happy, carefree child, blissfully unaware of the storm that was gathering on the horizon. I wept as I turned the pages, a torrent of tears for the family I had lost, for the innocence that had been stolen, for the love that had been so cruelly, irrevocably broken. But they were not just tears of a sadness. They were tears of a release, of a catharsis, of a deep, profound, and long overdue letting go. I finally understood. The album was not a weapon, not a manipulation, not a bribe. It was a gift. It was my mother's way of saying, I remember the good times, I remember the love, and I'm sorry. It was an apology, a confession, a plea for a forgiveness. And in the quiet, dusty corners of my heart, I found that I was finally, truly ready to give it. The decision to reach out to my mother was not a sudden, impulsive one. It was a slow, deliberate process, a series of small, tentative steps in a direction I never thought I would travel again. I started by writing letters I never sent, letters that were filled with all the things I was too afraid to say out loud. I wrote about the bookstore, about Liam, about Fitzgerald. I wrote about the life I had built, the happiness I had found, the peace I had made with the past. And in writing those letters, I found a clarity, a courage, a voice I never knew I had. Finally, after weeks of a hesitation, of a doubt, of a fear so palpable it was a physical thing, I picked up the phone and I called her. The sound of her voice, after so many years of a silence, was a shock to the system, a jolt of electricity that sent a shiver down my spine. She sounded older, frailer. Her voice a thin, reedy version of the booming authoritative voice I remembered from my childhood. We talked for a long time, our conversation a stilted, awkward dance of pleasantries and a small talk. We talked about the weather, about our health, about the mundane, everyday details of our lives. We avoided the big things, the important things, the things that hung in the air between us, unspoken, unresolved. But it was a start. It was a crack in the wall of a silence, a tiny, fragile ray of a light in the darkness. We started talking more regularly, our conversations becoming easier, more natural, less fraught. We were like two strangers, cautiously, tentatively, getting to know each other for the first time. I learned that she had sold the house I had grown up in, the house that was filled with so many ghosts, so many memories. She had moved into a small, manageable apartment in a retirement community, a place where she had made friends, where she had joined a book club, where she was, to my surprise, happy. I learned that Kevin had been released from prison, that he was living in a halfway house, that he was working a menial, low-wage job, that he was, for the first time in his life, on his own. She spoke of him with a strange, detached sadness, a sense of a resignation, of a love that had been stretched to its breaking point and had finally, irrevocably, snapped. She did not ask me to see him. She did not ask me to forgive him. She simply stated the facts, a quiet, unemotional reporting of the wreckage of a life. One day, during one of our regular phone calls, she said, "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I'm so sorry." The words were a quiet, heartfelt confession, a plea for a forgiveness that was so raw, so genuine, so utterly devoid of a manipulation that it brought tears to my eyes. "I know," I said, my voice thick with an emotion. "I know you are." And in that moment, the last lingering vestiges of my anger, of my resentment, of my bitterness melted away, like a snow in the spring. I had forgiven her. I had forgiven my father. I had even, to my own astonishment, forgiven my brother. But most importantly, I had forgiven myself. I had forgiven myself for the years I had wasted, for the anger I had carried, for the love I had withheld. I had forgiven myself for being human, for being flawed, for being a work in progress. A few months later, Liam and I drove to see her. It was a strange, surreal experience, like stepping into a parallel universe, a world where the past had been rewritten, where the wounds had been healed, where the broken pieces had been put back together again. She was smaller than I remembered, her hair whiter, her face etched with the lines of a life that had been both hard and long. But her eyes, when she looked at me, were filled with a love, with a regret, with a deep, abiding peace. We sat in her small, sun-filled apartment, surrounded by pictures of a life I had never known, a life she had built in the aftermath of the storm. We talked for hours, our conversation easy, comfortable, familiar. We laughed, we cried, we shared stories. We reconnected. We remembered. As we were leaving, she pressed a small velvet box into my hand. "I want you to have this," she said, her voice soft. Inside there was a simple, elegant pearl necklace, the same necklace she had worn on her wedding day, the same necklace I had admired as a child. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice choked with an emotion. "Thank you." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "You're welcome, my love," she said, her voice filled with a warmth, with a sincerity, with a love that was as real and as true and as unconditional as the love I had always dreamed of. The pearl necklace became a talisman, a tangible symbol of a forgiveness granted and a relationship reborn. I wore it on special occasions, a quiet, elegant reminder of the long, arduous journey we had taken, my mother and I, from the desolate landscape of the estrangement to the sun-drenched shores of a reconciliation. Our relationship was not perfect, of course. There were still moments of awkwardness, of a hesitation, of a past that was too painful to ignore. But we were learning. We were growing. We were building something new, something better, something stronger, on the ruins of the old. We visited her regularly, our trips becoming a cherished ritual, a pilgrimage to the heart of a family that was slowly, painstakingly, healing itself. We would spend our days walking on the beach, browsing in antique shops, sharing stories over cups of tea. We were creating new memories, happy memories, memories that would one day, I hoped, outnumber the sad ones. During one of our visits, my mother told me that Kevin had asked about me. He had heard that we were back in touch, and he wanted to see me. The request was a stone dropped into the calm, placid waters of my newfound peace, sending ripples of an anxiety and a dread spreading through me. I had forgiven him, in the abstract, in the quiet, private corners of my heart. But the thought of a seeing him, of a being in the same room as him, of a looking into the eyes of the person who had caused me so much pain, was a terrifying prospect. I didn't know if I was ready. I didn't know if I would ever be ready. I talked to Liam about it, my voice a jumble of a fear and a confusion. He listened patiently, as he always did, his hand a steady, reassuring presence on my back. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," he said, his voice a gentle reminder of the truth I so often forgot. "This is your decision, your choice, your life." His words were a gift, a permission slip to honour my own feelings, to trust my own instincts, to put my own well-being first. I decided not to see him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that was okay. Forgiveness, I was learning, was not a one-size-fits-all proposition. It was a personal, individual journey, a process that unfolded at its own pace, in its own time. There was no right way, no wrong way, only my way. I wrote a letter to Kevin, a letter that was honest and direct and compassionate. I told him that I had forgiven him, that I wished him well, that I hoped he would find peace and happiness in his life. But I also told him that I was not ready to see him, that the wounds were still too deep, the memories still too raw. I told him that I needed to protect my own peace, my own happiness, my own hard-won serenity. I did not know how he would react. I did not know if he would understand. But it didn't matter. The letter was not for him. It was for me. It was an act of a self-love, of a self-preservation, of a fierce, unwavering commitment to my own well-being. It was a declaration of a independence, a final, definitive severing of the toxic ties that had bound me for so long. It was the last chapter in a long, painful story. A story of a loss and a grief and a betrayal. But it was also a story of a hope and a healing and a redemption. It was the story of how I lost a family and found myself. It was the story of how I learned to let go of the past, to embrace the present, to create a future that was filled with a love and a joy and a peace that surpassed all understanding. And it was a story that was, I finally realized, all my own. The years that followed were a testament to the quiet, unassuming power of a life well lived. The bookstore continued to be our anchor, our sanctuary, our connection to the community we had come to love. We watched as our town grew and changed, as new faces arrived and old friends departed, as the rhythm of a life ebbed and flowed like the tide. Our friendship with my mother deepened, evolving into a rich, complex tapestry of shared experiences, of a mutual respect, of a love that was both resilient and unconditional. We were no longer just a mother and a daughter. We were friends, confidants, allies in the grand, unpredictable adventure of a life. She became a regular, beloved fixture at the bookstore, her sharp wit and her encyclopedic knowledge of a classic literature making her a favourite among the customers. She would sit in her favourite armchair by the window, a cup of tea in her hand, a mischievous twinkle in her eye, and hold court, dispensing literary advice and life wisdom in equal measure. She was a woman transformed, a woman who had shed the skin of her past, who had emerged from the chrysalis of her grief, a vibrant, resilient butterfly. The change in her was a source of a constant, quiet amazement to me. It was a reminder that it is never too late to change, to grow, to become the person you were always meant to be. One day, a letter arrived from Kevin. It was the first time he had written to me since I had sent him my letter, years ago. I opened it with a sense of a trepidation, my heart pounding with a familiar, anxious rhythm. The letter was short, just a few lines, but the words were a revelation. He was getting married. He had met a woman, a kind, gentle woman who had seen the good in him, who had believed in him, who had loved him back to life. He was working a steady job, he was sober, he was happy. He wrote that he understood why I had not wanted to see him, that he did not blame me, that he was sorry for the pain he had caused. He wrote that he hoped that one day we could be a family again. The letter was a peace offering, a white flag, a tentative, fragile bridge across the vast, silent chasm that had separated us for so long. And to my surprise, I found that I was ready to cross it. I talked to Liam about it, my voice filled with a sense of a wonder, of a hope, so audacious it was almost terrifying. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that reached his eyes. "I knew you would be," he said, his voice filled with a love, with a pride, with a deep, unwavering faith in the goodness of my heart. We went to the wedding. It was a small, simple affair, held in a sun-dappled garden, surrounded by a small group of close friends and a family. Kevin was a man I barely recognized. The angry, defiant boy I had known was gone, replaced by a quiet, humble man with a kind smile and a gentle, unassuming grace. He hugged me, a long, heartfelt embrace that spoke volumes, that said all the things that words could not. "Thank you for coming," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion. "It means the world to me." I looked at him, at the man he had become, at the happiness that radiated from him like a warm, gentle light, and I felt a sense of a peace settle over me, a sense of a closure, of a full-circle moment that was so perfect, so profound. It was almost holy. The past was the past. The wounds had healed. The broken pieces had been put back together again, creating something new, something stronger, something more beautiful than what had been before. We were a family again. Not the family we had been, but a new kind of a family. A family forged in the fires of adversity. A family built on a foundation of a forgiveness, of a redemption, of a love that was strong enough to withstand the storms of a life and to emerge, on the other side, whole. The wedding was a turning point, a definitive, irreversible shift in the tectonic plates of our family dynamic. The anger and the resentment that had defined our relationships for so long had been replaced by a tentative, fragile hope, a shared desire to build something new, something better, on the ruins of the past. It was not an easy process. There were still moments of awkwardness, of a hesitation, of a past that was too painful to ignore. But we were all committed to the work, to the slow, painstaking process of a learning to trust each other again, to love each other again, to be a family again. Kevin and his wife, Sarah, became a regular part of our lives. They would drive down to visit us on weekends, and we would spend our days walking on the beach, playing with Fitzgerald, sharing stories over long, leisurely meals. Sarah was a gift, a breath of a fresh air, a kind, gentle soul who brought out the best in Kevin, who loved him with a fierce, unwavering devotion that was a joy to behold. She was the sister I had never had, and we quickly became close friends, confidants, allies in the sometimes baffling, always entertaining world of the men we loved. My mother, in her new role as a doting mother-in-law and a soon-to-be grandmother, was in her element. She blossomed, her sharp edges softening, her cynical wit giving way to a warm, infectious joy. She and Sarah would spend hours poring over baby name books, knitting tiny, impossibly soft sweaters, planning the baby shower with a military precision and a boundless enthusiasm. It was a joy to watch her, to see her so happy, so fulfilled, so completely, utterly in her element. The birth of my nephew, a chubby, cherubic little boy they named Leo, was a moment of a pure, unadulterated joy, a tangible symbol of a new beginning, of a future that was bright with a promise. I held him in my arms, his tiny, perfect fingers wrapped around my own, and I felt a love so fierce, so profound, it was almost overwhelming. He was a miracle, a testament to the power of a forgiveness, of a redemption.